Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the East-West Philosophers Conference. My name is Joseph Tanke. I'm a professor of philosophy here at UH Manoa. It's my honor and privilege to introduce this panel on Continental perspectives on trauma and healing. We'll have three speakers today, including myself, all of whom have some connection to Boston College, and two of whom are my teachers, so it's a great privilege for me to continue this conversation with them. First, we'll be hearing from Professor James Bernauer, who was the Kraft Family Professor of Philosophy at Boston College and the longtime director of the Center for Jewish and Christian Relations. Unfortunately, Jim is not with us, so he's pre-recorded his talk, and then he'll be with us via Zoom for the question and answer period.
The title is Traumatizing Good, Soul Tremors in the Holocaust Killing Fields. Okay, Traumatizing Good. My project investigates the traumatizing effects that encounter with the good, the morally admirable, has had on many. We're certainly aware of the trauma brought on for soldiers by liberating such places as Nazi camps after World War II. There's also the paralysis that may follow the meeting with certain people. One of the most vivid of these was Albert Speer's description of his father's meeting with Adolf Hitler. Fortunately, I thought my last task, I thought this task was initially to be far less personally stressful, not a confrontation with the demonic, but rather with the good and noble. And that was chosen as my project before I appreciated the traumatic effects that such an encounter might have had and continue to have for some. I should have recalled Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, that is a 1938 historical event, but also a permanent symbol of the shattered reality that the Holocaust has left behind. My database of these good and noble is made up of the righteous Gentiles that Israel's Yad Vashem institution has collected. The term righteous of the nations is currently more frequently employed for these people. Its archives are the repository of the accounts of the actions by non-Jews who risked their lives or lost their lives in saving or trying to save Jewish lives during the period of the Holocaust, most often for strangers. As of January 1st, 2022, Yad Vashem has recognized 28,287 righteous, and the long-term director, now retired, of the program, Mordecai Paudiel, claims that this figure perhaps represents only 10% of those who should be honored. With the exception of Oskar Schindler, these thousands of rescuers have largely been neglected, even if recent years have witnessed a growth in museums dedicated to the righteous. Whatever general example their lives might provide, all too often falls under a widespread prohibition on seeking instructions from the period of the Holocaust. There are more than a few scholars who advise against any moral tutelage by this period, because frequently they claim that the lessons that are drawn tend to be either too singular or too vapid. For example, the loss of belief in the Enlightenment's conviction in the perfectibility of the human being, or the realization of limitations to progress and the continuing presence of evil. Peter Novick locates the desire to find lessons in the Holocaust experience in the hope, in the quote, hope of extracting from the Holocaust something that is, if not redemptive, at least useful. I doubt that it can be done. End of quotation. Michael Maris has developed an entire book dedicated to the question of Holocaust lessons, and he fears that the desire to develop such lessons leads to a casual approach to the actual history of these decisive deeds. Although he recommends the study of the Holocaust because it promotes a deeper appreciation of human reality, he concludes, "My principal lesson of the Holocaust is therefore beware of lessons." Most recently, Daniel Stone criticizes any effort at what he calls beautifying the Holocaust by the desire to learn from it, and maintains that the Holocaust teaches us nothing. Of course, there are other voices, and these often recommend concrete implications. Peter Hayes draws a clear one: beware the beginnings. Once someone yields to a small injustice, she is often on a path to excusing great injustice. Among other lessons are faith in the ability that one is able to make a difference, the need to engage in history, and the obligation to be on the side of victims, the duty to recognize basic moral principles and the bonds that unite human beings, the conviction that there is an ultimate meaning to life beyond the present. The opposition to the drawing of lessons especially extends to analysis of the righteous and has left a troubling ignorance. This is the group I'm concerned with. Whenever I have asked my students, as well as others, to estimate how many righteous have been recognized by Israel's Yad Vashem Center, the numbers guessed are almost always ridiculously low. And this is a common viewpoint. Even the chairman of the Committee for Designating the Righteous, as late as 1974, suggested humorously that planting a tree in honor of each rescuer would hardly lead to a forest of trees on the Avenue of the Righteous at the Yad Vashem campus, which is an avenue set aside to honor the righteous. Originally, they were going to plant trees for each individual. In fact, though, there's long been no space for the number of trees, and the names of the righteous are now honored on a wall of remembrance. About 500 names are added each year, usually by the grandchildren of one of the rescuers or one of the, in more often the case, people who were saved. And it's a very strenuous process to be recognized. Many people were turned down because you have to show that it was not done for any money and that there was a real risk to one's life in doing it. There were many people who rescued others, but their lives were in danger. The righteous have not yet found their place on the landscape of our moral imagination, despite the publication of the 10-volume Encyclopedia of the Righteous among the nations, the efforts of some distinguished scholars, and the ongoing work of Israel's Holocaust Center. One of those honored by this center was celebrated in 2014 in a special way on the centennial of his birth, Jan Karski, who gave the moving report in the film Shoah on his visit to the Warsaw Ghetto, and who spent most of his life as a professor at Georgetown University. But Karski criticized Lanzmann, the creator of the film Shoah, for having ignored the rescuers. And he said that it was terribly important to remember them for two reasons. First, because they were a morally significant part of 20th century history, and he even went as far as to put forward a lesson to be learned, namely, that institutions, not people, failed during the period of the Holocaust. In 1987, he emphasized that the Jews had not been totally abandoned because approximately 500,000 had survived in Europe. The Jews, were abandoned by governments, social structures, church hierarchies, but not by ordinary men and women. The second reason Karski gave for increased remembrance was that the neglect of these rescuers perpetuates the idea that all are or potentially are anti-Semites. The very study of these righteous represents an ongoing critique of anti-Semitism. Contrary to my original expectations, it was not consolations, but rather a web of traumatic feelings that developed among many toward the Yad Vashem project, which would recognize the righteous. I had encountered the argument that identification of the righteous should not have excluded Jews. Pierre Sauvage, the California filmmaker, was but one of those advancing this claim. He writes, "I'm interested in righteous people and righteous conduct, not in non-Jews per se. I also do not like the inadvertent implication that there weren't some equally remarkable Jews acting on similar values and about whom, incidentally, we know even less than about the Gentiles." End of quotation. I was to discover that it was certain Zionists in Israel who had opposed any acknowledgement of Jewish rescue as a result of some ongoing Zionist contempt of diaspora Jewry in particular, of diasporous Jewry in general. As Ronnie Stauber has pointed out, most Zionists, particularly young people, thought the Holocaust was something that Jews should be ashamed of, a disaster for the diaspora that Israeli institutions should ignore. When survivors of the Holocaust arrived in Israel to help build a new nation and wished to tell the stories of their heroism in saving fellow Jews during the Holocaust, they were quickly silenced because their stories were at odds with the negative diaspora image of passive Jews. These survivors remember the American Jewish community as more compassionate. Among other effects, this silencing might have led to a slighting of the rescuers' activity. As the son of one survivor judged, quote, "I don't have any statistics for this, but my belief is that the vast majority who survived the Holocaust did so by accident, sheer luck, but totally random circumstances, not because they were helped by righteous people." End of quotation. This zone of silence was widespread, emerging from multiple sources. Many people lost the faculty of verbal description for such realities as death camp. As Dory Laub observed, quote, "Loss of coherent speech constitutes the ultimate step in an unconscious empathetic identification with the victims or the bystander for whom the perpetuated atrocities make no sense whatsoever and cannot even be experienced as real." End of quotation. A German post-war young man recalls his youth, quote, "I had the feeling of growing up in a permanent shadow, in some gray, unclear substance that covered memories and feelings, as if I could look at reality only through a tinted glass. Nobody would speak out. I remember those silent lunches where I heard only the clinking of knives and forks. The absence of speech and laughter were more disturbing to me than anything I might have heard about World War II. It was also an understandable reaction to a survivor's experience, as the son of one deciphered, quote, "I realize now that the practice of hiding important things and not disturbing them was an unspoken value in our house. My father's wartime experience in Hungary taught him that sometimes you choose to hide who you are, sometimes the truth about yourself can be hidden by others, and sometimes you must hide to survive." End of quotation. If we were to continue asking why the righteous have been neglected, it may be that so many of our institutions, political, religious, and academic, do not wish to have attention drawn to the opportunities that were available at that time for aiding the needy, opportunities that those institutions did not themselves recognize or seize. And in a paradoxical way, our attention may have been directed away from a consideration of the activity of resistors by the general approach that our Western culture had taken to World War II. This was the good war that was won by the greatest generation. And so the rescuers were absorbed into a broader climate of moral triumphalism. We have come to recognize that this depiction of the war was somewhat mythic, certainly simplistic. Along with those revelations, scholars have given us a better sense of the brutality of the Allied bombing of German cities and its killing of approximately 500,000 civilian occupants. And Americans have long lived with the debate over the use of atomic weapons on Japan. Did this new scholarship draw a shroud over any claim to good activities in general? And has there also been a gender bias among scholars? Because the majority of rescuers were women, often being the first people to confront a request for need and the most important channel of communication among the resistors. Has there also been an age bias that favored the rescue of adults rather than the children with whom the women were most involved? In studying and teaching issues of the Holocaust, I was long struck and impressed by a curious statistic. A significant source for the lack of attention toward rescuers may be the fault of the rescuers themselves, because they were so consistently modest about what they had done. A major analyst of the rescuers' own explanations for what they did asserts that only 3% of them thought what they did in risking their own lives and saving those of others, primarily strangers, only 3% thought it was extraordinary. Only 3%. Today, I doubt that modesty is the appropriate term to use in examining the statements of the rescuers. Certainly, as I know from my own research in the Yad Vashem archives, it is fitting for some. It may also be the case that taking such a matter-of-fact approach was one condition that facilitated aid to Jews. Still, I have long underestimated the pressure that the righteous were subject to, the pressure not to stand out from the mass of men and women who did not assist others. To make of their conduct a model was to shame that of most others. Their self-effacement guaranteed that no huge archive of substantial personal explanations would be left behind. And there is reason to think that some of the rescuers themselves wanted to hide their good deeds, good works, out of fear of their neighbors, many of whom were either anti-Semitic or who would have been angry that their personal lives had been put in danger by hiding Jews in their villages. I'm going to switch to the paralysis of scholars. Even if such an archive had been created, however, would contemporary scholars have had appropriate questions to pose to it? Elie Wiesel and the filmmaker Pierre Sauvage organized a conference in 1984 in which many righteous and various professors were brought together. This is what Sauvage recalls of the event. Quote, "We brought all these righteous Gentiles to Washington, and in the breaks between sessions, the righteous were standing around being ignored by the scholars. No one spoke to them, no one engaged them. How can scholars not be fascinated by these people?" End of quotation. Very few historians have have even commented upon the rescuers, let alone focused upon them. The masterful, comprehensive work of Saul Friedlander, among the most highly regarded of contemporary Holocaust historians, does not treat the rescuers even though he himself was rescued. Have scholars lost the ability to engage with moral and spiritual dimensions of historical action? The judgment on rescuer testimony can often be harsh. As one historian wrote, quote, "When rescuers do say anything at all, it is almost always uninteresting, a banality of good that is so consistent across gender, class, language, nation, and generation as to give pause." End of quotation. In sharp contrast, Kristen Renwick Monroe testifies to how the righteous promoted her own evolution as a thinker. To quote her, "Academics are taught to be analytical and impartial. The rescuers taught me something different. They forced me to leave the safety of the scholar-subject relationship and challenged me to become a friend and a repository. I was not prepared for this, and it changed me." End of quotation. How might spiritual motivations and realities be captured by a mentality that is no longer familiar with religious perspectives? How might one do justice to the eminently personal? Has Western intellectual life continued to be infected by the failure of the intellectuals during the 20th century, whether the context for that failure be the ideologies of communism, anti-communism, fascism, or National Socialism? Victor Klemperer, the German Jewish writer, certainly thought that the intellectuals deserved special opprobrium for Nazi criminality, and concluded that while ordinary people should not be held responsible, he would have, quote, all the intellectuals strung up and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from the lamppost for as long as it was compatible with hygiene. End of quotation. Victor is a strong writer. How will 21st century intellectuals come to be judged? My next section is trauma of the churches. It is striking that the Christian faith seemed largely irrelevant to the motivation of the righteous in their analyses. And this weakness reflected a general frailty. The trauma of the church's generally self-serving conduct during the Nazi years may perhaps best be appreciated in its response, or better, its general lack of response to the pogrom of November 9th, 1938, usually identified as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. More than 1,000 synagogues throughout Germany were destroyed, and yet there was no official ecclesiastical condemnation. Interestingly, ordinary people made up the engaged supporters of the pogrom, as well as its large number of opponents. Among these opponents were Catholics from rural areas, at least one group of which organized a public pilgrimage to a burnt-out synagogue. Very dangerous in those days to have done that. For them, the Nazi burning of synagogues was the twin of the Bolshevik destruction of the churches that had taken place in the Soviet Union. Certainly, there were exceptional church figures, such as the Catholic priest Bernhard Lichtenberg, who called for prayers for the Jews, and the Protestant pastor Julius von Jahn, who preached against the Nazis. Although there were many others with these two, such as Bishop von Galen, who preached against the so-called mercy killings, the common response to their courage was a general silence that sounded through Germany. Still, the churches have probably been the most public and most vigorous in repenting their failure. And this could have been anticipated by some initial reactions on the street. when people saw the bombing of churches such as Cologne Cathedral as a proper punishment for the burning of the synagogues. A few of these churches have been left as a permanent memorial of the trauma. Nicholas Church in Hamburg and the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin are probably the best known. But the most dramatic effort to express sorrow for the widespread indifference to the desecration, to the destruction of Jewish houses of worship, was probably the 1986 visit to the Synagogue of Rome by Pope John Paul II. For the first time, a pope entered a synagogue and sat as an equal with the chief rabbi. He had been in synagogues before, both as a child with his father and in 1968 as Archbishop of Krakow when he expressed solidarity with the Jewish community at a time of communist purges of Jews in Poland. But the visit of a pope was very different, an event that announced, as perhaps no other could have, but how unprecedented was his ambitious vision of the new relationship between Christianity and Judaism. His friend and confidant Jerzy Kluger recalls his memory of the papal event. Quote, "There was one word burning inside him more than any other, genocide." Kluger is accurately remembering that the Pope used the term in expressing his abhorrence for the genocide decreed against the Jewish people during the last war, which led to the Holocaust of millions of innocent victims. And John Paul II did not refrain from recalling pre-Nazi manifestations of hate, while pointing out that acceptance of religious pluralism was a slowly arrived at achievement. He went on to state that, quote, "A centuries-long cultural condition could not prevent us from recognizing that the acts of discrimination, unjustified limitation of religious freedom, oppression also on the level of civil freedom in regard to the Jews, were, from an objective point of view, gravely deplorable manifestations." End of quotation. I'm shifting now to cultural hostility to the rescuers. What is particularly troubling is that this scholarly indifference has shown signs of even developing into a cultural hostility toward the righteous, whether viewed as individuals or within a general perspective. For example, the novelist Dara Horn recently wrote of American education's tidal wave of, quote, pseudo-inspirational Holocaust stories. She claims that the broad appeal for celebration of the righteous, which is not a broad appeal at all, means accepting a world in which morality is optional. And this example merely encourages people to, quote, be exceptions in their society instead of demanding that they change the society itself. End of quotation. Last year, the Brown University historian Omer Bartov took Timothy Schneider's new book, Black Earth, to task for making the rescuers far more saintly than he thinks they deserve to be regarded. Bartov asserted without any documentation that more often than not, rescues involved bribery and exploitation. He titled his review, "How Not to Write a History of the Holocaust." Mark Grossman claims that we are now learning how often money, property, cheap labor, sexual favors, or religious conversion were the price of help. In his view, classic leadership qualities are more significant than individual empathy. From another perspective, the very influential philosopher Richard Rorty thought that the rescuers should not be regarded as manifesting a universal love for humanity, but rather approached in terms of more parochial interest, such as sympathy for a colleague or a nationalistic identification. Earlier, the philosopher Beryl Lang objected to the very term righteous because it implied that one's failure to be heroic made oneself unrighteous, and he regards the distinction as, quote, invidious and offensive. It establishes a norm that condemns bystanders as non-righteous Gentiles. Are people who do not risk their lives to be regarded as morally guilty, as reacting with indifference? What happened to the notion of innocent bystanders? He titles his essay Contra, quote, Contra the Righteous Gentiles. Some years later, Lang took a somewhat different approach to the righteous. Quote, the paucity and numbers of the heroic rescuers furthermore reflects the broader difficulty of ever finding an adequate explanation for their extraordinary acts of conscience or courage. For me, this difficulty recalls the failure elsewhere of artistic or scientific genius. Their occurrence is too exceptional to fit ordinary categories, or perhaps any categories at all. And why, after all, should there not be a place for moral genius as well? It sort of shuts down the questioning. End of quotation. As far as traumatic effect is concerned, does the sharp distinction between the righteous and the non-righteous lead to a general suspicion of non-Jews? And where would that lead? Peter Novak reports on a Jewish reaction that he hears with remarkable frequency. Would their friends hide them or their children in extreme situations? He quotes a professor of psychology who claims that this question is frequent among Jews, even himself. Quotation, I have asked myself this question innumerable times. Sometimes I surprise myself by answering, I don't know, when asking this question of a non-Jewish friend I had otherwise assumed was close to me. The answer is the ultimate standard by which to measure trust in a non-Jewish person. End of quotation. In an August 23rd, 1947 interview with the leader of religious affairs for the American military occupation in Germany, several German bishops and cardinals seemed indifferent to, if not even critical, of courageous measures by Catholics during the Nazi years. They strongly rejected criticisms of their own conduct under the Nazis. Cardinal Joseph Frings of Cologne, who was the titular head of the German church at the time of the interview, asked the questioner, quote, who has the right to demand that the bishops should have chosen a form of a fight that would have sent them to the gallows with infallible certainty, and which would have resulted in a campaign of extermination against the church. End of quotation. Bishop Albert Stohr of Mainz denied that the survivors of concentration camps were more courageous than the bishops whom they were now criticizing. He claimed most of them were thrown in concentration camps against their will as a result of indirect utterances and secret actions. Also, many of them became victims of their own imprudence and rashness, which have nothing to do with courage. End of quotation. Bishop Johannes Dietz of Fulda argued that the conduct of the German bishops followed the highest model. Quote, the basically pastoral attitude of the church is taken from the higher example set by Jesus when he was brought before the high priest, before King Herod and Pilate. End of quotation. This model of humility certainly reflected a Catholic theology which praised the cultivation of passive virtues as particularly appropriate for the Christian life. Virtues such as obedience, patience, gentleness, mortification. But militant conduct was not always dismissed. Rejecting the example of Franz Jägerstätter, Terrence Malick has a film out on him called A Hidden Life from 2019. But rejecting the example of Franz Jägerstätter, who was executed for refusing to serve in Hitler's army, the Bishop of Linz praised the soldier model. And to quote him, I consider the greatest heroes to be those exemplary young Catholic men, seminarians, priests, and heads of families who fought and died in heroic fulfillment of duty and in the firm conviction that they were fulfilling the will of God at their post, just as the Christian soldiers in the armies of the heathen emperor had done. End of quotation. We are at a curious moment in our current approach to the rescuers. In 2007, a major museum opened in Poland to celebrate the almost 7,000 Polish rescuers honored by Yad Vashem. But the museum was criticized for creating the impression that these heroic individuals represented the principal story of Polish conduct during the Shoah. Indeed, although there is suspicion of their motives and even claims that the rescuers might be insane for having risked their lives and that of their families, often for strangers, there is a small countercurrent evident in a number of recent published studies that have attempted to do justice to the remarkable people who seem to hear a more urgent voice of conscience than most of us. Conclusion. We know that this catastrophe of the Holocaust has influenced us in countless subtle and explicit major and minor ways. For example, the obituary writer in the New York Times speculated that Henry Kissinger's rejection of a moralistic diplomacy was rooted in his view of civilized German culture's embrace of Nazism. A contrasting scene was a Jewish family's refusal to take possession of a house allotted to them in Israel because they saw that it belonged to a Palestinian family, which had been forced to become refugees. To quote them, we were in shock. The house was beautiful, but we didn't even enter the house because in the yard there was a round table set with plates. And as soon as we saw this, we were frightened. And beside the fear, we could not look. It hurt us. How could people, it reminded us of how we had to leave the house and everything behind when the Germans arrived and threw us into the ghetto. And here it was just the same situation, and it was not in us to stay. I did not want to do the same thing that the Germans did. We left, returned the key, and stayed elsewhere. End of quotation. If we concentrate on the impact of an eclipse of the righteous witness, it is clear that our ethical lens has a diminished moral perception of ourselves as well as others. As the longtime director of the Yad Vashem Righteous Project, Mordecai Paudio, put it, to quote him, by identifying with the righteous, we lay claim to the goodness in us, which is as inherently human as the other less pleasant manifestations in our behavior. End of quotation. And in doing that, we touch the spiritual existence of one another. What might replace this model of goodness? Will it be the celebration of our shrunken souls? One example that a well-regarded philosopher has put forward is a so-called, quote, decent life that is understood as the permission we have to limit our aid to others if our own lives risk diminishment. The mandate of this decency is, quote, to avoid the rigors of extreme altruism and enjoy your moral behavior as best you can, end quote. Decency, for him, occupies the space between moral purity and moral depravity, and embodies in itself in such acts as, and these are his views of the acts that are decent, quote, helping an older person across the street, lighting a cigarette for a stranger, holding the door for someone you don't know, end of quotation, and so on. Such trivialization of our moral lives is a high price indeed to pay for being traumatized by the witness of the righteous. Thank you very much.
So next we'll hear from Professor Kevin Newmark, who is a professor of French in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at Boston College. He was someone who really brought to life for me when I was a student the beauty and brilliance of 20th century French philosophy. And he'll be speaking today on the topic, The World is Gone, Responding to Trauma with Celan, Gadamer, and Derrida.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Joseph and the organizers, and now I should probably thank you for your patience and having to listen to what Steve Odin yesterday mentioned as a very long paper that's likely to put you to sleep. And he decided not to read, so I will read it for him, although it's the one that I wrote. I begin with a little epigraph. Apprends à penser avec douleur. Learn to think with pain. And you may be subjected to a slightly painful talk right now. The epigraph is from Maurice Blanchot, a text called The Writing of the Disaster. How does one begin thinking? That is the first question addressed to Emmanuel Levinas during an interview with him in early 1981. It begins, Levinas starts off by responding, through traumatisms. Traumatisms to which one would not know even how to give linguistic expression. A separation, a scene of violence, a sudden consciousness of the monotony of time. To suggest, as Levinas does, that thinking begins with trauma is susceptible of producing its own type of shock effect, especially if we stop long enough to consider carefully not just what he's saying, but also and especially if we reflect upon how he is saying it. Separation, violence, time. Those are the three specific examples Levinas gives of originary trauma, though he insists that a crucial feature of such traumatic experience would be the way it defies the possibility of putting it into language, of even giving them the very names by which Levinas is himself identifying, evoking, and providing them with meaning in the French language he is speaking. In other words, Levinas uses precisely those verbal forms that remain unavailable to the actual experience of trauma, separation, violence, time, in order to begin responding to those traumatisms that he says allows thinking to begin. Thinking begins with trauma, but trauma is not itself originally thinkable. And so Levinas will have to continue this first attempt at a response by qualifying it with further precision. It is with the reading of books, he immediately adds, and not necessarily philosophical books, that the initial shocks become questions and problems, that they offer something to think. Trauma gives thinking something to think. Les chocs initiaux donnent à penser, Levinas says, using a French idiom, donner à penser, which carries, in addition to the sense of offering or providing, a connotation of demand, appeal, or challenge. Trauma offers thinking what is first given to thought, but this gift to thinking, a gift for and of thinking, is also to be received as an obligation, a question to spur thinking that is also a problem for thought. An appeal to think the trauma that in giving thought the material for thinking also challenges, resists, and perhaps even remains beyond all thinking. Trauma, the initial shocks, separation, violence, time, give to thought that which obligates its thinking. But thinking, which in this text by Levinas also names the task of philosophy, requires that the initial traumas from which it results become questions and problems for philosophical thought. The traumas that originally defy language, traumas to which one would not know even how to give a name, donner une forme verbale, become questions and problems for thinking through a very particular kind of contact with language, through the reading of books. Thinking begins when the first shocks become questions and problems for it. In other words, when they become the objects of philosophy, through the reading of books, though not necessarily through the reading of philosophical books. The books Levinas names at this point are not, in fact, philosophical texts. I quote, "The role played by national literatures can in this respect be very important," end quote. Thinking begins from traumas, but not until those traumas become questions and problems for thought through contact with a certain kind of language, one that passes through what Levinas calls national literatures. Not, Levinas quickly adds, because one learns words from them. What can be learned specifically from what Levinas characterizes as national literatures are not merely words, the verbal forms that in any given language allow one to give a name to originary traumatisms such as separation, violence, and time. The reading of national literatures can play the role of allowing those initial shocks to become questions and problems for thinking, precisely because, as Levinas goes on to say, it is in such texts, and now I quote again, that one lives la vraie vie qui est absente, the true life that is absent. La vraie vie est absente. Levinas signals it for us by putting those words between quotation marks. Would be one particular example taken from a national literature, in this case, French literature. The text from which the well-known citation, La vraie vie est absente, true life is absent, is selected by Levinas from a poem called A Season in Hell, a prose poem by Arthur Rimbaud, published in 1873. What interests us in the present context about Rimbaud's poem is the very active philosophical reading Levinas gives to this fragment. What a peculiar claim Levinas seems to be making for literature, since it is precisely within a literary text, a fiction, that one would most naturally and quickly assume that true life is absent. And yet, Levinas goes out of his way to cite Rimbaud's words, which in the context of this poem are attributed fictively to a vierge folle, a mad virgin, inside his, Levinas's own positive affirmation that it is indeed inside national literature that one lives the true life that is absent. True life, la vraie vie, Levinas suggests, is absent from real life, everyday life, to the degree that in that life, books have for the most part been reduced to serving as sources of information, reduced to providing a tool for accomplishing realistic objectives in the world. But reading books does not necessarily have as its sole or even dominant function the satisfaction of quotidian aims, concerns, and cares. To read literary texts can be important beyond, beside, or beneath whatever linguistic or extra-linguistic information they contain. Reading literary texts can play an important role in beginning to think, Levinas points out, because whatever else they offer, the verbal forms found in these texts also give access to ontological questions and problems. They do so, moreover, by allowing originary traumas to come into contact with the kind of language with which Such traumas can then become the questions and problems from which thinking has to begin. If la vraie vie est absente, if true life is absent from the quotidian world of utilitarian ends and aims, then it will follow that truly ontological questions and problems, thanks to which thinking will have to have been able to proceed from the unnameable initial shocks, would take place by virtue of what might happen only in a new and derivative type of traumatism. Only through an interruption, a tear, a rupture, a separation from the world of everyday realities, of empirical time and place, could thinking begin. And therefore it could begin only according to a time and a place, not of this world. A violent scene of separation from the world, one that necessarily entails what Levinas calls the destruction of the primacy of clock time. Such would be the event enacted by a kind of reading, a contact with language, an experience of verbal forms made accessible through literary texts, or more precisely, a violent scene of separation that can always be inaugurated by reading the idiom of any text, spoken or written, whenever, wherever the everyday world of empirical time and space is interrupted and ruptured by a certain kind of contact with its verbal forms. With respect to the pre-ontological world in which language functions or is supposed to function only according to measurable standards of information and utility, the verbal forms of Rimbaud ceaselessly allow a new kind of language to come forth, a virgin, poetic territory that cannot appear as anything but mad by reference to the world it serves to interrupt and impose itself upon. In Rimbaud's poem, moreover, the affirmation, la vraie vie est absente, true life is absent, is followed immediately by what might be considered a kind of corollary. La vraie vie est absente, nous ne sommes pas au monde. True life is absent. We are not in the world. To live the true life that is absent, however, should not too quickly be taken to mean that true life could ever be made present to us in some other, better, higher world than the one we know. In this text by Rimbaud, or at least in the reading that Levinas proposes, to live the true life that is absent would much rather be to undergo, to endure, to participate in what must forever remain absent when it comes to what the poem calls true life. Should we consider it a mere accident that precisely at the point in the poem that refers to the true life that is absent, a new personal pronoun appears in the speaking voice? The je becomes a nous. The I of a mad virgin becomes a we. With the affirmation that true life is absent, the speaking voice situates itself within a relation between itself and some other one. True life is absent, and we are not in the world. How should we read the sequence of these two poetic declarations, each of which constitutes an affirmation of what is not present as such, true life, the world? Is it perhaps because true life is absent that we together can be said as a result not to be in the world? Have we, you and I, somehow lost or left the world because true life remains absent? Or perhaps can a verbal form articulating the relation between self and other, the first person plural pronoun we, can that be pronounced for the first time only through a prior affirmation that true life is constitutively absent, and for the same reason necessarily absent for you and me, one for the other, inside our relationship to each other, necessarily separate from and therefore outside the world? True life is not present for you and me in this here world. It is absent, and so too are we. Insofar as we together have anything to do with true life, insofar as we, any of us, all of us, are left absent from a world defined in the first place by being present. For us not to be in the world, not to be present to the world of present beings, would that not be our first step together toward an experience of the true life that is absent, toward saying, one on behalf of one particular or any other, since true life is absent, for the sake of true life that is, only in its being absent, we are not in the world. True life is absent, and so you and I do not belong to the world of present beings. From the moment I can say in any given idiom, true life is absent, I must be able to say that to you. I must be able to share that affirmation of true life's being absent with you, confide it in you as a secret between us, apart from everything and everyone else in the world. And from the moment you are able to hear and affirm with me that true life is absent, from that very instant, would we not also be able to say, one to the other, one in place of the other, we are not in the world is gone. But this you and I, it should be recalled, this us, of which it is now possible for me or you or someone else to say that we are not in the world, has a most peculiar status. As Levinas points out, the affirmation of absent being of true life, as well as the corollary affirmation of a relation between you and me that can take place only outside the present world. Both of these affirmations constitute together an experience first made accessible to us through a reading of Rimbaud and his poetic language. It is thanks exclusively to the specific verbal forms inscribed in this poem that the initial shocks to which they bear witness, a separation from the world, a violent tearing away from true life, a sudden consciousness of indistinct, empty, infernal time, become accessible as problems and questions for thinking only that way. They become accessible, that is, more specifically to us. They're confided to us by the poem. To you, to me, to whoever is able to read the singular verbal forms in which those traumatisms become legible as questions and problems for thinking. It is therefore the poem, the language of the poem, that gives us, to you, to me, to anyone at all, the chance to begin thinking those originary traumas to which, without the poem, we would not know even how to give a verbal form. And therein lies the insuperable paradox, a paradox so unsettling that it then becomes capable of inflicting a new wound on our thinking. For how can the verbal forms through which Rimbaud's poem bears witness to originary traumatisms, traumatisms irreducible to anything but those his own text would be capable of evoking, referring to, beginning to think, and exclusively in the form we currently have of his text? How can such verbal forms in any way be adequate to expressing, much less thinking, the specificity of those initial shocks belonging in a singular way only to me alone and no one else? Shocks without which, according to Levinas, I would not have been able to think. But equally and almost unthinkably, shocks to which on my own, and as a result of them, I will have remained incapable of giving the verbal forms through which alone they might become questions and problems for my thought. Could it be that Rimbaud's poem also helps to discover, if not the solution to the paradox, at least a way of enduring it, of bearing the wound it threatens to inflict on me whenever I read the poem with the help of Levinas in this manner? Would it not be precisely the shift between the je and the nous, the I and the we, inscribed in Rimbaud's text, that signals another possibility for reading and thinking the affirmation, we are not in the world, in its relation to the mad virgin who declares true life is absent? Although Levinas does not cite the second affirmation and therefore does not mention the striking introduction at that point of the pronoun we know that for his own thinking, the enigma of originary trauma remains indissociable from an awareness of the dissymmetric relation of the subject to the other. when the reported speech comprising Rimbaud's Mad Virgin, and while the reported speech comprising Rimbaud's Mad Virgin is by no means easy to interpret, it is indisputable that it recounts in the mode of a delirious confession the suffering to which the subject is subject on account of its submission to an imperious other, whose own sufferings, even to the point of death, the speaking self shares and espouses. Rather than considering the appearance of the we a consequence of a lucid recognition by an autonomous subject that true life is absent, would it not be more legitimate to read the madness, the originary and thus virgin state of the subject, who speaks only through quoted speech in Rimbaud's poem, as the necessary effect of its inaugural response to the other, as articulated here for the first time in the pronoun we? To say we from within the radical dissymmetry of the one responding for, in the place of, and crushed by the other, would that not, all on its own, be enough to introduce absence at the heart of what the Mad Virgin calls true life? In that case, the madness to which the Virgin bears witness would consist in the trauma received through her exposure to the other, the madness of what Levinas calls substitution, and by which whatever she says, and despite whatever she might intend in saying, would speak at the same time of her lost identity in favor of the other, in the place of the other, and at the behest of the other's absent truth. A speaking made delirious by the substitution of the self by the other, to whom it becomes in this way bound over as a hostage. If Rimbaud's poem is able to provide the verbal forms through which originary traumatisms can subsequently become questions and problems that give thinking its chance to begin, that's because it bears witness to how those initial shocks are always given from an opening, a certain kind of inaugural tearing or rupturing suffered by the self at its very source, in its very virginity. Subjected in the first place to the infinitely demanding proximity of the other, the first trauma must somehow, in a hardly thinkable, mad manner, be the trauma of separation endured by the self from itself, from out of its substitution in place of the other. Such an experience, a necessarily violent scene to which no self could ever have simply been present, would just as necessarily entail a sudden consciousness of time as it emerges precisely from this violent scene of tearing and separation, of self-alienation or substitution, that oversees a self-awareness forever indebted to an always anterior proximity of the other. To begin thinking would therefore consist in thinking the trauma of the other, with the of functioning here at one and the same time as subjective and objective genitive. It would mean to think in the place of the other the trauma to which every finite other is as such exposed. And it would mean to think one's own initial shocks as traumatic exposures to the other, as legacies passively received from the intrusive proximity of the other, before or outside any possible distinction between action and passivity, between or outside any sense of appropriation or being in the world. Thinking begins from traumatisms because at the beginning there is traumatism and nothing other, or rather there would be nothing but the other's traumatism. I cannot therefore think the initial shocks from which my thinking must begin without thinking them through the other, from whom I must have originally sustained the shock. And for that, I need the other's language. The language I cannot appropriate, that I can never claim as or make my own. To think the trauma of the other I receive, to think the trauma I receive from the other, I remain obligated to the language of the other. The language of Rimbaud's Mad Virgin, for example, For only in another language could I ever think the singularity of the other which always goes beyond my thought. The traumas from which my thought, in the other's language, will have had to begin. Only by subjecting myself to the other's language, only by allowing myself to be touched and wounded by it, could I begin thinking what Levinas on several occasions calls une pensée pensant plus qu'elle ne pense, a thinking that thinks more than it thinks. Such would be the affect of a traumatism I can receive, become affected by, only in the place of another. A thinking that carries me beyond my thinking in response to a call I can receive only from the other, and therefore in the other's language. But why should this place of the other taking place from my thinking in the other's language find its privileged example in a literary text? Is the poem singled out by Levinas only because it happens to offer him the chance to say what he himself wanted, philosophically, to say about la vraie vie? For Levinas, la vraie vie would be the life of a human being, absent from the world, of self-reflexive, self-concern with one's own being. La vraie vie of human being could therefore emerge as a question and a problem for thinking only when language as saying, le dire, is considered not simply as a means of communication, of knowledge, of philosophical thematization, le dit, but instead as a site where one encounters, undergoes exposure to the infinity of the other in its very inaccessibility. Is it not then the case that Levinas has recourse to Rimbaud because the poem, literary language, the language we identify and read as literature or fiction, in distinction to all other uses of language, including philosophical language, always retains in its saying a trace of the radical and ineffaceable alterity to which it bears witness. In other words, does the word poem not first of all name a site from which the preserved trauma of the other becomes able to address me in the singularity of an idiom irreducibly tied to the event of its own saying, an incessant summons which I may perhaps receive only by taking responsibility, substituting myself for the open wound constituted by it? Is what would be most proper to the experience of reading a poem not precisely this hardly thinkable place, where thinking is always required to think more than it thinks, in the place and for the sake of the others, other, whose language remains preserved there? Would the poem not then be the exemplary place of traumatic experience, and as a consequence a non-place? We are not in the world, proper to no place and to no one. As such, the poem would have to mark the place of an impossible substitution, an encounter that could take place only between the absolutely singular language of the other and whoever, no matter which one, each and every other one, without qualification, might respond to its call, to be registered only by subjecting oneself to and substituting oneself for what it says, and so taking responsibility in one's own name for the irreplaceable language in which the poem makes its claim on speaking. At this point, Paul de Man writes in an essay devoted to the triumph of life, the long fragment that constitutes Shelley's last poem. At this point, figuration and cognition are actually interrupted by an event that shapes the text, but which is not present in its represented or articulated meaning. The event to which de Man refers is the actual death and subsequent disfigurement of Shelley's body, burned after his boat capsized, and he drowned off the Ligurian coast in 1822, a few days before his 30th birthday. De Man writes, "It may seem a freak of chance to have a text thus molded by an actual occurrence, yet the reading of the Triumph of Life establishes that this mutilated textual model exposes the wound of a fracture that lies hidden in all texts. If anything, this text is more rather than less typical. Can we locate what Demant calls the wound of a fracture? A wound that is therefore also a break, a rupture, and an interruption hidden in the text by Levinas that we have been reading? Is what Levinas offers not also a model of mutilated reading? A question of traumatism or wounds that becomes problems for us in Rimbaud's poem. What would be the actual occurrence that shapes or mutilates Levinas's own text, and perhaps the one by Demant as well, but which is not present in its represented meaning? And finally, is it a mere accident that Demant chooses to conclude his reading of a text that just happens to be called The Triumph of Life, with a reference to the way the accident of Shelley's death is what now functions as a decisive textual articulation? It is precisely this separation of Shelley from his own text, the violent scene of his death, that cannot become present, however, in the represented meaning of his text, and which suddenly interrupts and therefore mutilates its temporal continuity as a poem, that Demant will go on to associate with a curious mode of responsibility, an obligation for whoever reads and responds to the poem. In Shelley's absence, Demant writes, the task of thus reinscribing the disfiguration now devolves entirely on the reader. What does Paul Demant mean by referring in this way to the task of reading when it comes to trauma and death? According to Demant's reading of Shelley, the singular poem by Shelley to which Demant's essay responds, what now devolves on, falls upon, is transferred or bequeathed to the reader as a burden to carry, as a task to carry out, would therefore also become a kind of responsibility. To reinscribe the disfiguration, the wounding reduction of the poem to the status of a fragment which results from the author's absence or death, and which is secretly written into its margins as the event that gives it shape. However, and on the other hand, there is something remarkable, curious, peculiar to the point of shocking about the way Demant characterizes such an act of reinscribing the traumatic absence or actual death of the other, which absence he insists can be exposed in the wounding fracture that lies hidden in all texts, and which now devolves entirely upon the reader. That peculiarity is no doubt the way that this mutilated model of reading, which would consist in taking responsibility for the traumatic text of the other, or the other's trauma as text, so forcefully resists having recourse to a familiar and reassuring thematization of healing. In Demant's text, reading is not construed as a process that operates in the service of healing the traumatic experience of facing another's death, either as a result of or in order to begin taking responsibility for it. Furthermore, even more surprisingly, the aim of healing is in no wise considered by Demant an effective strategy of dealing with, in other words, of reinscribing, the traumatism of death. If the wound of this kind of trauma always results from an exposure to death, and more precisely, the death of the other, then the wound cannot be healed. The wound of death cannot be healed, made hale, whole, healthy, unscathed. It can only be hidden, kept out of sight, buried away, covered over, and therefore, in some sense, forgotten, and by dint of any number of conscious or unconscious strategies. Such strategies, Demant suggests, no matter how resourceful, well-intentioned, and refined, do not result in healing the wound of the other's death. All they can accomplish in one way or another is an always only relatively successful denial, verneinung, of the trauma. To reinscribe the disfigurement suffered by an exposure to death trauma in such a way that it is not simply buried and forgotten, in such a way that the wound is not hidden or denied, but also exposed, that it is carried as a task by the one who survives, and then reinscribes it by bearing witness to and taking responsibility for it. That would be one way to read, and therefore reinscribe what Daman means by reading as disfiguration. However, and to the degree that it actually does reinscribe the absence or death of the absolutely singular other to whose trauma it bears witness by first being exposed to and then reading its traces, would such a testimony not at the same time necessarily betray and thus disfigure in its turn what it must nonetheless translate into another idiom in order even to begin taking responsibility for it? Shelley's poem, for example, is treated by Daman as an utterly singular way in which it exposes the wound of a fracture, the author's death, that lies hidden in all texts without exception. And yet, precisely insofar as it is exceptional and incomparable, Daman also treats this one poem, The Triumph of Life, abusively, as a general example of every other poem. Each and every poem, moreover, in its absolute singularity, the irreducible definition of what we call poem, boiling down to its unbreakable link to the specificity of its idiom, its untranslatability as poem into any other language, that is to say, the language of anybody else. Each and every poem exhibits in its own way what is true of each and every trauma, of every single subject, universally, since what we call a subject in the full philosophical sense of the term is nothing but the virtual site for what can be suffered by every subject, and suffered only in the mode of trauma, a separation, a violent scene, a sudden consciousness that tears open the monotony of time. It is strictly impossible to translate any given trauma from one idiom into another, from one side of the border separating each trauma from all others, the Shoah, the Nakba. Each one is untranslatably different from the other, and yet, today, more than ever, making that impossibility of translation possible is no doubt among the most pressing obligations for our thought and our decision-making. If for Levinas's true life, la vraie vie, of which Rimbaud's poem speaks, can begin only by suffering the traumatic experience of a certain kind of between us, a nous, a we, an exposure of the subject to the finitude, the death to come of the other, then being absent from life would by the same token constitute the very first condition of that truth. La vraie vie est absente, in a bold extension of that interpersonal model. The Triumph of Life, as it is read by Paul Daman, finds its decisive textual articulation in the actual death of the poet, which thereby reduces the poem to a disfigured fragment of its author. In Daman's essay, The Triumph of Life functions as a traumatic trace of that absent other, whose survival, thanks to what Daman calls re-inscription, now depends exclusively on me, the reader. The fate of Shelley's poem, of any text conceived as the bodily remains, as all that is left of an open mouth that can no longer speak for itself, is never guaranteed. Every poem addresses and thus devolves upon the reader as subject, as a task, a legacy bequeathed by the text to whoever, whichever I, you, me, whoever we are, might be eventually able to read and then take responsibility for the spectral absence to which its singular traces must always bear witness. Nous ne sommes pas au monde. You and I, the we, the entre nous, that according to Levinas can emerge only in my obligation toward you, through my necessary exposure to your virtual absence and death. Neither one nor the other of us can be in this world. At least, that is, we cannot be in the world without, to some extent, denying or forgetting the traumatic separation from the world that will have been suffered at some indeterminate instant by the one, me, for, in the place, and for the sake of the other, you, left out of the world. All of this will have become legible in the singular and irreducible idiom of a post-romantic French poem by Rimbaud and a romantic British poem by Shelley. Though legible in these two absolutely unique poems only by dint of the signed responses prompted by them on the part of a philosopher, Levinas, and a literary critic, Deman. All of that and much more can also become legible, though once again, in an irreducibly idiomatic fashion, in the breathtaking response offered by Jacques Derrida to several of the poems written in German by Paul Celan. A reading of Celan's poems, staged by Derrida as an integral part of the testament he dedicates in February of 2004 to his friendship with Hans-Georg Gadamer, who had died 2 years earlier. As though Derrida were also responding to the challenge, the provocation, the enigma, and the risk that is posed for our thinking whenever it is confronted by the obligation to think the hardly thinkable relation between language and experience when it comes to the traumatic event. In other words, when it comes to the relation between the poem and the singular trauma to which it might alone, like nothing else in the world, bear witness. And it goes without saying, almost, that this obligation to think trauma, even to the point of its ultimate resistance to thinking, becomes all the more demanding and painful when Derrida allows the personal trauma of losing his friend Gadamer to mingle with, to affect and be affected by, to commingle indissociably with the historical traumas of loss suffered by all those who, like Paul Celan, endured today, such traumas in the incomparable mode of selectively motivated and viciously violent victimization. How can Derrida join together in one text two such disjointed times of trauma? The time of his friendship with Gadamer, begun with a suspended conversation in 1981 and sealed forever with the death of Gadamer's death in 2002, and the time of Celan's poetry, begun in the wake of the Shoah and sealed, though far differently, by his own death, a suicide, in 1970. Or rather, why does Derrida's text, why does it insist on bringing together in one single text these two heterogeneous temporalities of trauma? The one absolutely untranslatable in terms of the other. How could the traumatic time of collective persecution and genocide for which Celan's poetry incontestably bears witness and which remains infinitely far and irreducibly different from the trauma suffered at the time of Gadamer's death by Derrida, ever be made consonant with Derrida's warm and touching, if also melancholic, commemoration dedicated by him to the absent friend? Derrida's reading of Celan is too complex to summarize easily, never mind quickly. However, there is one line in particular from Celan's poetry that draws Derrida's attention and orients above all the movements of his own text. It is a line that would be difficult, if not impossible, not to read as a periphrasis, a circumlocution that names trauma. The event, the experience, the bearing witness to trauma by the survivor. It comes last in a poem of 14 lines, though its arrival is marked by a long pause, a formal break, an interruption between it and the 13 lines that preceded, allowing us, if we choose, to read it as what could have once been considered a sonnet, but is no longer quite that. A disjointed, mutilated, spectral remnant of a traditional form of poetry, which for some reason has now gone missing. Derrida describes the placement of the line as situated on the edge of an abyss, after a blank space, forming the last breath, the expiration of the poem in a final sigh. In German, the last line reads, Die Welt ist fort, ich muss dich tragen. The world is gone. I must carry you. Of course, Derrida does not mention the way the line could be taken as a subtle intertextual reference to the lines of Rimbaud's Season in Hell I have been commenting upon with the help of Levinas. True life is absent. We are not in the world. Derrida seems to give permission to detach the line in this way from Celan's poem, since Celan has himself detached it. As a remnant capable of wandering away from the other lines, from which it has already been partly severed, it might be read to refer back to Rimbaud's text, though also by altering it, by insisting on the way a traumatic separation from the world always includes a responsibility on the part of whoever might survive, a responsibility to carry the other who either is presently no longer there or one day will have gone. On the other hand, inside Derrida's own text, the line by Celan is clearly meant to refer to the way that Jacques Derrida, bereft of his friend Hans-Georg Gadamer, left alone in the world after the world of Gadamer is gone, must, as Paul Demant said, carry out the task of reinscribing, bearing witness to whatever can survive from the others, Gadamer's absent world. That world of Gadamer now gone absent. But, and I'm finally getting to my conclusion, the permission Derrida seems to grant in Celan's absence to read the text this way or these two ways is only conditional. This line, the world is gone, I must carry you, leads Derrida to his own confession. Quote, when I first discovered the poem, I confessed this as a possible misdeed, une faute. My fascinated reading pounced right away on the last line. Given that Celan has so carefully both detached the line from the other 13 that preceded and kept it, preserved it as a surviving line, hanging on to just this poem and no other, to read it outside the context of its relation to the other 13 lines, as I'm doing right here and now, that is a possible misdeed, une faute, a mistake, even an offense. To read the line as Derrida does indeed suggest we read it, in reference to friendship and to all the blessings attendant upon friendship, including perhaps the blessing that accrues to the melancholy survivor who carries friendship beyond the traumatic disappearance of the other's world, and acts, in fact, what the poem demands from reading it. Surviving the absence of Celan and whatever absolutely singular meaning, an entire world of meaning, in fact, he alone, Paul Celan, intended by the you addressed by the poem. Derrida accepts the obligation, müssen, ich muss, put on him by the poem, to carry the world in place of Celan's absent intention. He is thus faithful to whatever secret trauma is sealed forever inside the line signed by Celan. But he also betrays it, for he carries it beyond the poem by translating it into a new idiom that he, Jacques Derrida, countersigns in the name of friendship and with his own name. Can it be just for Derrida to do this? Does Derrida not do an injustice to Celan in translating, in carrying Celan's last breath beyond the wound of the fracture hidden between the 13th and 14th lines of this poem? The first words of Derrida's text are these: will I be able to bear witness in a just and faithful fashion to my admiration for Hans-Georg Gadamer? In another act of faithful betrayal, Derrida suggests at one point that we might invert the order of what appears at first to be the logical sequence of Celan's line. Because the world is gone, comma, I must carry you. What happens? What kind of impossible justice might appear, might become possible, Derrida's text seems to ask, if we read the same line this way: there, where I carry you, where I take responsibility for the trauma of your death, which has conditioned our entre nous from the start, well, there is where die Welt ist fort, where the world is or would be gone, the world where trauma fails miserably to name the trauma of carrying you, the unbearable world where so many, all of us, mistakenly and offensively deny the trauma of encountering you in your place precisely by subjecting you to every conceivable trauma in my place, which I try vainly to preserve whole, safe, and sound. I must carry you, Derrida's unjust translation, in the name and for the sake of another justice suggests, I must carry you in order to make this world, the world of persecution and genocide to which Ceylon's poetry bears witness and forever protests against. I must carry you in order to make this world, that world, gone. Make it gone. So I can also carry you, bear you, bring you into a world beyond that world. Carry you like an utterly unknowable child waiting to be born. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, it is my great honor today to introduce my dissertation advisor and one of the most brilliant and compassionate people I know, Dr. Joseph Tanke, Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He earned his PhD at Boston College. He's lectured and published extensively on issues and figures in continental philosophy, aesthetics, and the history of philosophy. His major publications include Foucault's Philosophy of Art, A Genealogy of Modernity, and Jacques Rancière, An Introduction, Philosophy, Politics, and Aesthetics. Professor Tanke recently completed with Colin McKillen the Bloomsbury Anthology of Aesthetics, a textbook for use in courses dedicated to aesthetics, the philosophy of art, and literary theory. He was recently awarded a Fulbright Scholarship and will be traveling to Hungary this upcoming year for research on aesthetics and political philosophy. Additionally, Professor Tanke is interested in comparative aesthetics, social and political philosophy, and the historical ontology of pain within Western thought. And recently, out of great love for his graduate students and endeavoring to better understand their research, he's even been delving into Buddhist philosophy. Today, he will be presenting Time Heals All Wounds. But first, because this is Hawaii, before you give any talk, you always have to get laid. So, Dr. Tanke.
Well, I feel like I'm in a bit of a pickle because I too wrote a long paper, but it lacks the poetic brilliance of Kevin's paper. And I thought that I would rather assemble a few slides and talk about the history of the concept of trauma as it occurs in Western thought. But I also fear that I lack the charisma of our own Steve Odin, who spoke yesterday. So the paper that I wrote was on this piece of proverbial wisdom, time heals all wounds, which has been intruding on my thoughts almost in a traumatic way ever since the theme of the conference was announced. And so my paper deals largely with why I hate this expression so much. And some of that will come across in what I have to say. But what I hope to contribute this morning is a sort of Foucauldian history of the concept of trauma, which I hope will allow us to think about the limits of this concept, as well as some of the prospects it might hold for cross-cultural and comparative philosophy. One of the things I hope to do, though, is to hold open the space between trauma and healing. Because one of the things that offends me most about this expression, time heals all wounds, is the facile answer it gives to this question our conference organizers have put before us. What is the connection between trauma and healing? Is it possible to come up with an intellectually credible, intellectually responsible answer to it? One of the things I admire, thinking from the vantage point of comparative philosophy now, one of the things I admire most about the continental philosophical tradition is its refusal to name the traumatizing force of the trauma, to try to give it a specific name or meaning. And I think that that's part of an ethics of hearing and of trying to hear others better. So my question is, if in thinking through the history of this concept, can we expand it? Can we escape from it? So I begin with this old saw, time heals all wounds, precisely because it intrudes upon the concept of trauma. If trauma is a wound, then time heals all traumas. This is an expression that was that is used in many different contexts. One in the Cleveland, Ohio of my youth, one could hear it in a doctor's office just before they send you on your way with some stitches and a cast and a bill. Time heals all wounds. Or I think about the times when one is confronted with a loss of a loved one or a romantic relationship, and eventually one's overburdened friends shrug and say, time heals all wounds. This expression's even uttered in times of great catastrophe. So looking into the history of this expression, one of the things I discovered was that I think it was 7 or 9 days after 9/11, then President George W. Bush said before a joint session of Congress, time is a great healer. The Washington Post then published an editorial saying, time heals all wounds. Let's get back to enjoying sports. So the proverb is also a cliche. And I would say that the cliche is a symptom of our incapacity to deal with trauma. And so my wager here is that if we can think of trauma as something that departs from the wound, and this will be a big theme in what I try to say today, that if we think about the ways in which trauma, which is quite literally the Greek word for wound, has come to depart and drift away from that literal meaning, then we might be making space to hear others. So my worry is about the way in which the conventional wisdom intrudes upon the concept of time. And I probably have way too many slides for the time I'm allotted, so I'll move quickly. And then my sense is that it will be difficult to prevent this connection, trauma and healing, from occurring unless we begin to give up the wound or begin to think beyond the wound. Can one attend to the traumatizing force of the trauma as such? I think a larger argument would be needed, but I think that in figuring trauma as wound, we're already participating in a kind of theodicy that tries to make meaning out of the experience of trauma by insinuating it within a redemptive conception of time. There are many different possible readings of this proverb, and one of the things that I've learned and one of the things that we might discuss is that it has quite a lot of cross-cultural resonance. Most cultures have some version of this expression, time heals all wounds. And I just distinguish between three possible ways of reading this. A passive reading, which would say something to the effect of, with time, wounds heal themselves. A conditional reading, wherein time is a condition, something that's necessary for healing to take place. Or what I call the providential reading, according to which time itself is the agent of healing, and that it oversees, guides, and ensures. You warned me about that, David. That it oversees and guides. Guides the healing itself. Let me use the clicker rather than try to. So when we say this to one another, we're quoting, we're citing, and we don't necessarily know what we're citing. And the Dictionary of Proverbs actually alerted me to this, that it is a fragment from the Greek dramatist Menander. And it's an unidentified minor fragment. And so this is all we have for the context. If lengthened, age is apt to rob us of all else. At any rate, it makes intelligence the more secure. Time is the healer of all necessary evils, and even you it will now heal. So it there's a lot of difference between this and the proverb that comes down to us that we might talk about. but the promise is there. You will be healed by time. One of my objections to this expression is that I think it fundamentally disfigures the experience or the relationship between trauma and time. And there's a lot of phenomenology and a lot of psychoanalysis that one could cite at this point. But phenomenologists and psychoanalysts are pretty much in agreement when they say that trauma impacts our experience of time. And that part of the estrangement that traumas produce pertains precisely to the ways in which the traumatized subject in some ways remains beholden to the past. I won't read these full quotes here, but you can see Donna Orange, for example, suggests that with respect to socio and historical forms of trauma like settler colonialism, trauma destroys our normal sense of time such that organizing our lives towards a future loses sense, loses direction. Part of what I'm doing can be understood in terms of contribution to the discourse of trauma studies, which was very prominent in North American universities in the mid-1990s and early 2000s. This was intended to be a new ethical mode of listening to and responding to others by taking seriously moments of disruption as they occur in the literary text. This is one of the foundational texts edited by Kathy Carruth, whose work I'll cite in a minute, and you'll see that our own Kevin Newmark had a contribution in this volume as well. As a Foucauldian, one of the things I like to think about are what are the historical a prioris, and so what are some of the events which led to the formation of this field of trauma studies? And undoubtedly, one of them would have to have been the publication of DSM-3 in 1980, which for the first time includes the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. As a Foucauldian, I would love to spend the session talking about the difference between all the various versions of the DSM, but the DSM-3 is really quite special in that it's a marked departure from DSM-1 and DSM-2, which were articulated in terms of largely psychoanalytic categories and used rather expansive concepts of neurosis rather than the taxonomic mental medicine that we know today. So this is really when these taxonomies of different mental disorders are being named. In DSM-1 and DSM-2, trauma is used to designate almost exclusively brain injuries. And it's in DSM-3 that a form of psychological causality is recognized. So I just put up here excerpts from these definitions. There were two forms in DSM-3. And what's noteworthy here is the recognition that symptoms can follow from a psychologically traumatic event. As I'll show you, I think if I have time, the characteristic symptoms that the DSM points to are actually very old and something that have been discussed within the fields of neurology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry since the 19th century. A catastrophic age. So I want us to hear the promise of trauma studies, or one of the promises that trauma studies makes, or that Kathy Carruth makes in her introduction to this volume, when she ends this essay by calling for a speaking and listening from the site of trauma. And I'm particularly interested in this passage because this is one that has been singled out by post-colonial critics, and one which I think is particularly relevant for this event, and you'll see why in a minute. And she writes this: this speaking and this listening, a speaking and a listening from the site of trauma, does not rely, I would suggest, on what we simply know of each other, but on what we don't yet know of our own traumatic pasts. In a catastrophic age, that is, trauma itself, and I underline this because I think at this moment she's speaking about the experience of trauma, not the concept of trauma. Trauma itself may provide the very link between cultures, not as a simple understanding of the pasts of others, but rather within the traumas of contemporary history, as our ability to listen through the departures we have all taken from ourselves. So Kevin talked a lot about the theme of separation. One of the ways in which trauma gets discussed within the Continental philosophical tradition is as a radical form of experience that undoes and redoes and remakes the conditions of experience itself. It's this form of separation from oneself. And so I find it really, really interesting, really paradoxical, really puzzling, and really worth mentioning for a group of cross-cultural comparative philosophers, this idea that the separation that ruptures our continuous sense of self might be the possibility for connection with others. Some of the post-colonial critiques that have been raised of this position, and there are many, I'm just citing here one, namely the work of Steph Krapps, focus on what the critics have called the event-based model of trauma. And I think this is really recurrent throughout the Continental tradition, that there's a tendency to talk about trauma in terms of a single blow or an event. They also question the idea that trauma pertains primarily to the individual as opposed to the collective or intergenerational forms of trauma. And these critics have also sought to go beyond what they call the aesthetics of fragmentation. I don't claim to do that in my talk. You will recall that I titled my talk Fragments on Trauma and Time, because I think trauma condemns us to the fragmentary. What kind of phenomenology of trauma is possible? But they've sought to question this idea that since trauma exceeds experience, it can only express itself or speak as instances of disruption and narrative failure. Okay, so my piece in this would be to say that if Carew thinks our response to others is premised upon our departure from ourselves, then I would like to suggest that it is necessary to depart from the idea of trauma as wound and wounding. This departure from the wound, I think, is already at work in the history of the concept of trauma. So I think that those three criticisms all hinge on the notion of the wound in some way. The wound is the result of an event. The wound is something that happens primarily to individuals, and that happens primarily to individuals. And then the wound is this event that produces disruption. My suggestion would be that one way in which the field of trauma studies, particularly in as much as it takes its inspiration from European philosophy, could accomplish this task to arrive at a better form of listening, particularly where non-Western peoples are concerned, should involve a critical interrogation of the way in which trauma has been and continues to be figured as wound. What's in a wound? The notion of the wound implies an event-based conception of causality. It figures trauma as something that applies primarily to individuals, and it prioritizes naturalized forms of interpretation over political explanations. It suggests as well a form of temporality and healing derived from the experience of the physical wound. If time heals all wounds and trauma is a wound, then time heals trauma too. And so ultimately it speaks in some way to a redemptive faith in the powers of time. A brief history of the wound. I think this is something that a Foucauldian should contribute to this gathering. The concept of the trauma neurosis emerged in the late 19th century. It was a Berlin-based neurologist named Hermann Oppenheim who introduced this concept in his book from 1884, Die traumatischen Neurosen. This analyzed 42 cases of industrial accidents and railway accidents. Starting in the 1860s, neurologists were perplexed by this class of injuries that were being produced by railway disasters, where patients had no lasting physical injuries, but nevertheless displayed all the symptoms that we've come to associate with trauma, things like headache, dissociative responses, shock-like form of paralysis, and even what Freud describes as the compulsion to repeat. If there's some literary historians may be familiar with the case of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was involved in a terrible railway accident from which he was fortunate enough to walk away from, but he came face to face and apparently tried to save some of the people who were dying, came face to face with death, and his children report, and there's ample scholarship on this in his biography, that he exhibited the signs of what we would today recognize as panic attack throughout the rest of his life, particularly when he had to undertake railway travel. Continue on with our history. I think one of the ways in which the concept of trauma neurosis becomes disseminated is in the teachings of the famous Parisian neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, particularly his famous Leçons du mardi à la salpêtrière, the famous Tuesday lessons, which were the 19th century form of edutainment. Charcot was quite a showman and famous for parading out his hysterics and other examples of mental illness and putting them on display for the general educated public. Recently, historians of psychiatry have sought in, so Charcot was a little bit ambiguous about Oppenheim's trauma neurosis. He preferred what he called hysteroneurasthenia, which covered a lot of the same ground. The major difference here is that Charcot wanted to attribute some significance to genetics, someone's hereditary formation and environment, not just shock and terror, although he saw that this played a large role in it. Now, of course, it's true of Charcot's most famous students who go on to really give this diagnosis of substance. The first would be Pierre Janet, who studies the dissociative response, and I won't talk much about Janet because I don't know all that much about him, quite honestly. And then Sigmund Freud, who in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle gives us quite a strong definition of trauma that continues to exercise influence on the way it's thought about in the Continental tradition. This is, I think, a great example of the event-based conception of trauma, so allow me to quote this text here. Freud writes, "We describe as traumatic any excitations from outside which are powerful enough to break through the protective shield. It seems to me that the concept of trauma necessarily implies a connection of this kind with a breach in an otherwise efficacious barrier against stimuli. Such an event as an external trauma is bound to provoke a disturbance on a large scale and to set in motion every possible defensive measure." So you see that Freud's view of trauma depends upon a kind of brain-mind dualism. He has all these really, before he introduces this in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he admits it's going to be wildly speculative, and he starts by talking about single-cell organisms and their protective shields. And he says the human being's not so different, and the psyche is like this protective shield that we form over ourselves, and when that psyche is in some way pierced or punctured or ruptured, that's the source or instance of the trauma. And if I had more time, I'd like to analyze some of the metaphors he uses. The English translation is that of crust or shield. So I say here, the Freudian theory is premised upon a kind of brain-mind dualism that's becoming increasingly unsustainable in the age of neuroscience and the regime of cerebrality it inspires. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, for example, Freud explains that in order to account for the trauma neurosis, one must understand the psyche as forming a kind of protective crust or shield or layer against excessive stimuli. Trauma is the breaking or piercing or rupturing of that protective shield. Some of the questions I've been thinking about and that I don't pretend to answer here: can our discourses on trauma withstand the naturalizing tendency that's at work in intellectual culture today? When we're not willing to affirm or necessarily affirm a brain-mind dualism like Freud is committed to. What could it mean to speak about trauma from the standpoint of neurobiology alone? And I think, as a philosopher, I think that neurobiology is fast eclipsing a lot of our territory. And one of the reasons I'm led to say this is because I'm a Foucauldian and I think a lot about Foucault's death of man. It's a misunderstood idea. Foucault's idea here was not that human beings would go extinct anytime soon, although we are now, speaking of a catastrophic age, we are now, according to climate scientists, in an extinction level event in which human beings will begin to go extinct. If you're familiar with the order of things, you know that Foucault analyzes three major historical periods within the development of the Western thought. What he calls the Renaissance age, l'âge classique, the classical age, which runs from about the time of Descartes, 1650, up until the era of Kant, and then the modern period, which he terms the age of man. And what's significant about the age of man is that it gives rise to the human sciences. And he calls this, Foucault refers to man as a strange empirical transcendental doublet that has to function as both the subject and object of its own knowledge. So he thinks our knowledges are caught in what he calls this anthropological slumber. And his claim was, and I think he says this in 1966, that man is fast being effaced by discourses like neurobiology, philology, and economics. And this is how the book ends. It's a famous image which some of you may know. As the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end. If those arrangements were to disappear as they appeared, if some event of which we can at the moment do more than sense the possibility without knowing either what its form will be or what it promises, were to cause them to crumble, as the ground of classical thought did at the end of the 18th century, then one can certainly wager that man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. So, it's not just analytical philosophers who are engaged with neuroscience, and one contemporary continental philosopher who's accepted the challenge of trying to think what could trauma mean purely from the standpoint of the nervous system, is Catherine Malabou. Malabou was a student of Jacques Derrida's, but she's also greatly informed by Michel Foucault, and her concept of the regime of she claims at one point that the regime of cerebrality, the idea that all our explanations have to ultimately depend upon what is known about the brain. She views this as the new form of sexuality. If sexuality for Foucault was a normalizing form of control over the body, so is this regime of cerebrality. Her work focuses on the concept of plasticity. And plasticity was not invented by neuroscience. It appears in the writings of Hegel and Freud as well. Her book, The New Wounded, which I recommend to you, it's quite interesting. Contains a section called Toward a General Theory of Trauma. And Malabou wants to say that what trauma is destructive neuroplasticity. And so this would be her contribution to the debate. The paradigmatic examples of this destructive neuroplasticity are stroke and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease. And what destructive neuroplasticity does is produce an absolute caesura within the experience of a life. And it's a very dark picture of trauma that I want to quote here. The destructive event that, whether it is of biological or socio-political origin, causes irreversible transformations of the emotional brain, and thus a radical metamorphosis of identity emerges as a constant existential possibility that threatens each of us at every moment. At every instant, we are all susceptible to becoming the new wounded, prototypes of ourselves without any essential relation to our past identities. Alzheimer's disease is a particularly important example of such a loss. A form of life appears that bids farewell to all the subject's old modes of being. This type of transformation unto death, this survival without sublation, is not only visible in cases of severe brain lesions, but is also the globalized form of trauma, appearing in the aftermath of wars, terrorist attacks, sexual abuse, and all types of oppression or slavery. Today's violence consists in cutting the subject away from its accumulated memories. So, if we had longer to discuss this, I would say that her concept of the new wounded remains wedded, thank you David, remains wedded to this event-based conception of causality, and it's necessary to complicate that a little bit. And it's not clear to me that the concept of the new wounded can do all the work that she wants it to do, that it can name these instances of destructive neuroplasticity, as well as the socio and political and historical forms of trauma that she wants to include under it. So there are three ways of departing from the wound that are available to us. Some post-colonial critics suggest giving up the concept of trauma entirely and talking about post-colonial syndrome. And this would be to favor Fanon over Freud. The second would be the notion of the soul wound that is prominent in the writing of Native American scholars and activists. And the third possibility is this concept of the disembodied wound that I'll spend a little bit of time concluding with. So, to say a word about the soul wound and what it does that's different than the wound as it's been articulated after Freud. It describes historical forms of trauma that are multi-generational, compounding, and cumulative. One of the other things that's significant about it is that in the instance of the soul wound, mourning is denied or impossible. So these authors write that the soul wound goes much deeper and encompasses the after effects of racism, oppression, and genocide. Finally, since I hate this expression, time heals all wounds, and we begin with this fiction from Menander, I thought I would end with this fiction from Chris Marker's Sans Soleil. I don't know if any of you know this film, but I highly recommend that you watch this film, which is, there's various ways it's an experimental form of documentary about his travels in Japan, and it's in some ways about the forms of separation that exist between cultures. Earlier in the film, Marker tells us that the era of globalization will be about the coexistence of different concepts of time. I've taken to saying that in order to study trauma, one must become a time traveler of sorts. And I think this is I take this from Marker. Marker invents a writer/philosopher by the name of Samura Koichi, whose words are intended to express the melancholy of traumatic separation. In this case, what he calls the fundamental rift of Japanese society, and probably every society, the rift that separates men from women. If I have more time, I would love to tell you about the absolute insanity that erupts around the figure of Samura Koichi. But I'll tell you, I have a couple minutes, I'll tell you about it anyway. Some scholars in reputable journals speak about this writer as though he were real. Some go on to call him a philosopher. I spent, some of the people I've made inquiry about this are here, so I want to thank you, Kyle, for checking into this. Samura Koichi, I think, is an invention of Chris Marker. I finally learned this by being in dialogue with some of the world's leading experts on the film of Chris Marker. But what he has to say about the disembodied wound, I want us to hear, because I think it's a better way of thinking about trauma than as the wound we inherit from Freud and other references. So it occurs at a very poignant moment in the film, and Chris Marker puts these words in Koichi's mouth. He says, "Who said that time heals all wounds? It would be better to say that time heals everything except wounds. With time, the hurt of separation loses its real limits. With time, the desired body will soon disappear. And if the desiring body has already ceased to exist for the other, then what remains is a wound disembodied." So what I like about this is that it's a wound that is not only disembodied, but a wound that doesn't heal, and a sentiment that doesn't speak to a redemptive conception of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talks. I love them. I was gonna just talk to the Professor Tanky and Professor Newmark. So I have two questions for you. Professor Newmark, I was interested in, so we talked before about Salon, and I was interested in your use of that. And I was curious, one of the things I think Salon's famous for, like, and you mentioned that with the sonnet, is breaking up the poetry, or like restructuring the kind of words. And so I was interested in, if you want to like say a little bit more about like how that ends up almost in, like in a concrete poetry sense, almost representing the kind of wounds that's undescribable. And I'm thinking sometimes in ways, like with some of like Salon's translations of Emily Dickinson, like some of the ways in which the very fragmentary nature of the poem ends up kind of representing that. I'm kind of thinking of Ben Ner's work on poetics. Like it points to the very fact that the poem is deeply fragmentary and pointing to this wound there. And then for Professor Tanky, I was actually just curious a little bit more about some of the, I think you wanted to talk about this anyway, some of the nuances about how that concept of wound shifts in the DSM. I know it's more history, but I'm very interested in that. Thank you.
If I hold it like this, you can hear. It would be more interesting probably to take individual examples, and I'm already anticipating that this is going to be the stock reply I will give to every answer, which is not so good. But since to some degree what my talk was really about was about the singularity, and at one point it came out the singularity of a trauma, which one tends to forget in order to generalize and understand it all, is going to be a problem if you say, what is Celan doing in all of his poetry? However, it probably is, in this context, one would want to emphasize the way that, having just seen Chris Marker talk about the disembodied wound, that what you have is a poetic form which is to some degree recognizable, but has been ruptured. So the spectrality of what otherwise could have been understood as integrated is important to recognize. And the way that there's, for some of the motifs I was using, that there's something in Celan that survives. Okay, it does not survive without drawing attention to the rupture. So that one line that for Derrida is so important, and was the only line I actually looked at, and what is carried on and beyond what otherwise would always be at risk of disappearing. There's something in what Celan is doing with the language that is making it, on the one hand, not proper. So the question is, and we don't want to forget in that case, I did choose rather consciously to have a poem in French and a poem in English and a poem in German. In the case of Celan, I don't think it's too far to go to say that it's whatever event or series of events or syndrome that his poetry bears witness to, it is something absolutely specific to the German language. However, it is not a refusal to use the German language. It is a return to a German language, which in many of the aspects that you're asking about, one could refer to as a kind of spectrality, a kind of surviving, which is disembodied in its own way. The body of the German language is there, but you can see in each instance how it has been cut into. It has been, according to the vocabulary that I was quoting from Paul Dumont, there's an effect of mutilation, which is clearly not proper to the German language, and calling into question the whole idea of proper and property that is part of National Socialist thinking.
On the question of, I'm loud. On the question of the history of the use of trauma in the DSM, I think what's interesting about trauma in the Continental tradition is it emerges in neurology, and it's always an attempt. There's always an attempt to trace it back to the body in some way, but our usage of it keeps departing from that, right? In an unavoidable way. And so finally in DSM-3, they're forced to recognize different forms of causality that can't necessarily be explicated or explained using modern scientific methods, yet.
Hi, I'm Saidi Rathodiker. I'm a professor here at EWPC. Thank you very much for having us. More directly into the mic, I was told. Okay. So maybe I'll say a few thoughts that have come to my mind after listening to your paper, Joseph. It was really awesome. That can connect to the panel and maybe Sean's paper yesterday and maybe Benjamin, your dissertation as well. In the sense, sort of rethinking of the site of trauma, Joseph, that you talked about. And maybe instead of thinking of the site where the trauma emerges, the site where the trauma settles with time. In the sense, for example, if you think specifically of body, and if I'm thinking of my body and recognizing that it's a little bit left of my spine, that certain traumas have settled, and if they re-emerge, then I can't walk, for example, or specifically vocal cords that are associated with particular traumas, and if they re-emerge, I can't speak, literally I can't speak. So whether it's in the body or in the broken, ruptured poetry, where our trauma settles with time instead of heals. And that, Sean, in that sense, the information that your body brings vis-a-vis the experience of the trauma and the dealing with it. And then the opposite of it, the disembodied aspect, is, Benjamin, when we talked about your ekstase, which is that your body becomes a shrine and it becomes inhabited by ghosts and weeds growing, and then you can't live there anymore. So you are basically, your trauma gives you an experience of being disembodied, that you're somewhere else and you can't come back to your body and live there anymore. I do not have a question. So these are the thoughts that came to my mind, and if you would like to respond to them, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Sai, thank you. The reason I'm trying to move away from the wound and move away from the event is to become better at hearing and seeing and sensing trauma in its multiple forms. So I appreciate that reminder. You know the famous book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's been a popular bestseller, right? So it's a similar kind of notion. The wild card of time is something I would like to ask you about, though, because that was one of the forms of trauma for Levinas. And I'm not yet sure how to think about that relationship. Separation, violence, and time. It seems like in some instances time is itself the wounding agent. Yep. I don't know, maybe we would talk about the difference the body has its own temporality. But the more I think about this problem, the less I'm certain about how to separate out the psyche from the body.
maybe I'll just add a great risk that the term trauma is not necessarily being used with the same kind of signifier. So there may be a separation inside the term. My paper did not exclude these cases that could be recognizably traumatic, but because it went to Lévinas and was using Paul Delon and Jacques Derrida, there was a risk that those discourses displace the idea of a pathology of trauma, because they suggest that without trauma, there would be no thinking, there would be, for instance, when Joseph is talking about the event, he's understanding it a specific way, but the way the same term would come back in my paper was there would be no such thing as any event. Nothing at all would be capable of happening if it weren't powerful enough, in Freud's little analogy, to break through the crust and leave a mark. So the very possibility, which is paradoxical, that an event to be an event, from a philosophical point of view, not from a therapeutic point of view, it has to, at one and the same time, exhibit its own singularity and leave a trace that would be recognizable and readable and legible for others. That's why something like the poem is being offered as an example. No poem can be mistaken for any other poem, and yet in order to be what it is, it has to run the risk of reproducibility. So what we mean by trauma in my case, or in Joseph's case, or what we mean by the event, or for instance the wound, every event is a kind of wounding, or else it doesn't take place. And in fact, we recognize that to the degree that we talk about. One of the things that's interesting about Joseph's focusing on time healing all was the way he was reading it. The term heal was very close to what I was suggesting in my reading of Paul Delon of forgetting. You know, time doesn't heal anything at all, but it might be a very effective way of forgetting. And to the degree that we're talking about witnessing and responsibility, is precisely what you want to resist in a certain kind of temporal ability to forget, which is a kind of simulacrum of healing that would return in the form of something spectral. I should stop.
Yeah, this is mostly for Professor Newmark also. And so I have a question about sacrifice in relationship to singularity and substitution, and specifically the RAM, or the singularity of the RAM, both Derrida's essay as well as the poem, and thinking about the first part of the poem, the first 4 lines, where Celan says, the vast glowing vault and the swarm of black stars pushing themselves up, in a way, in reference to the zodiac, and a kind of planetary perspective. I'm thinking of Dipesh Chakrabarty's book on the planetary, the global, and the contrast between the global and the planetary that we're sort of in within the context of global warming, right, and climate change. And thinking about the ways in which the global world is gone and the planetary inaugurates something new, and in a sense, like, whether we're all rams, whether we're all subject to sacrifice on the altar of climate change, global warming, extinction events, neoliberal capitalism, etc. And just curious about the ways in which the substitutions and the singularities all kind of amplify themselves in a kind of sacrificial conflagration.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I was feeling very guilty about not having given you any sense of what the poem by Celan was like. Now we just had it, okay? So that's very helpful. There's a lot there. It would take a lot of time to unpack that. There's many questions in what you were asking. The one that I would want to focus on in the very beginning is what is a RAM in in this conversation between Derrida and Celan, the ram is a figure for sacrifice. The poem by Celan, as it is read by Derrida, is a protest on the part of the ram against the operation, the sacrificial operation. So the way Derrida is reading the poem, in the first place, to begin answering would be to say that Celan, very quickly and elliptically got the word protest in at the very end, because the text by Celan as read by Derrida is nothing if not the voice of the poem on behalf of the ram, protesting against every possible operation of sacrifice. What would it mean for the ram to butt so hard against the world of sacrifice that world would be won, which is to some degree the way Derrida is reading it. That would be the taking on the responsibility of this particular text would be to begin saying no to a logic of sacrifice, which is always the logic of making a decision for the preservation of the self in the first place. So that's a first potential. We are all rams. No, to some extent, the power of the poem is to say, no, that's got to stop. The ram that this poem is about is a battering ram that fights back against the ram as a sacrifice. Or to come back to Jim's discourse, which one of us, for the sake of righteousness, will say no to a logic of sacrifice? And to come back again to Jim's talk, that the moment, the very, very beautiful moment where at the end of his talk, he brings us to Israel and a location of the wandering Jew who comes back home, and comes back home to find that the place of hospitality has itself been ruptured, interrupted, traumatized to some extent, if you want me to use that term, and says no. The kind of hospitality that is being offered here in the home toward the place, they're offering me safety and the possibility of healing from whatever it is I might have suffered, is to be purchased at the price of a sacrifice of the Palestinian family that was once here. It's very beautiful, I have to say. I liked it much more than anything that I said. It was actually comprehensible. So there's a very pragmatic example of no ram here, okay? Your other questions about the global and the planetary, and one would have to come back to the poem and see how the first stanza does give a kind of representation of a situation of explosion, which would in fact, I guess you could read that as an era of falling apart of global toward the planetary. But then the second stanza is that very strong moment of I burn my image on the silicified forehead of the ram. That stops. That stops in that one image the errancy, or seems to stop the errancy. So there'd be a lot. I should stop again. But thank you for that question. Glad people are reading the text by Derrida and Celan.
I would like to first thank all three speakers for making it clear to all of us we cannot escape thinking about trauma. And you also gave us some wonderful tools and text. I have a question to Professor Bernauer. I hope you can hear me. It's a little bit harder here with this mic. Can you hear me now? Is this good? Almost? You cannot?
You have a question for me, but I could not hear the question.
No, I just wanted to make sure you can hear me. All right. The question I have is one that I will preface with a family story that you might appreciate. My paternal grandfather was a Swiss custom official on the border with Austria during the war when Austria was part of Germany. And he had this bad habit of trying to prevent the Gestapo to make arrests when trains from Eastern Europe had already reached Swiss soil. And he would bring dozens of refugees, Jews and not Jews, to his home, and where they could wait until their documents were processed. Now, I'm not sure how much of that he did because he was thinking this is the right thing to do, and how much he did it because he couldn't stand the Gestapo and was just happy to spite them. Now, I think according to your philosophy, that doesn't matter. He did the right thing. And so I think according to the way how you look at rescuers, he qualifies as a righteous person. Now, the more important question I have for you, and that's something that I like to connect to some lectures we had yesterday on Buddhism. One lecture in particular was talking about habituation. Everything basically that makes us the cultural beings we are. We get habituated to judging of events, people, virtues, according to what we're taught, according to our religions and so forth. So I was wondering whether you would agree that we are habituated to think of good people, or what qualifies as good, as something that is very rare. We may be growing up, I think, that good people are very few. And we may be growing up, especially in a Christian context, thinking that good people are perfect, more like saints, kind of like above the average. And would you say that that is maybe a reason that makes it so hard for us to recognize many more rescuers? It may maybe also explain what you called, I think rightly so, the indifference of some scholars vis-a-vis the many more rescuers that existed. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the questions. I didn't catch all the nuances in your expressions, but let me just make a few points. One is I was basing the primary model of the rescuer that I was referring to on the very stringent standards that Yad Vashem enunciates. And there it is, one's life has to be at risk in trying to save this other person. And secondly, it could not be done for any financial reward. Now, with respect to the first one, it's clear that many people rescued Jewish people during that period, but their lives were not at risk. And the classic case they give is Cardinal Roncalli, who became Pope John the 23rd. And he did a lot of rescuing when he was the nuncio in Istanbul. But the feeling was that because of his high position, the Nazis would never risk imprisoning him. So his life was not at risk. Now, the second general question is, I tried to touch on a few of the issues of why people ignore these rescuers and why they haven't penetrated our moral culture. And part of it, one of the reasons is scholars may have lost the ability to speak about this dimension. And this is one of the reasons I find Foucault terribly helpful, as Joseph Tanki also does. In his last works, he brings up this issue of spiritual existence. And one of the reasons he did not receive more response at that time is that sort of beyond the realm of secular thinking, the way French academic culture was functioning. It's changed quite a bit now. But the key reason seems to be that the rescuers show how much could have been done. And we don't want to live with that. We don't want to live with the idea that so much could have been done and was done by people. 500,000 Jews lived after the Shoah in Europe. They weren't there by accident. They were saved. But governments, and this is very much dependent on what Jan Karski said, in that the part of the film Shoah that was not shown, much to Karski's annoyance, that he wanted to speak about these rescuers because the lesson they give was successful in terms of saving 500,000 people, or not that they saved all of those 500,000 people, but a substantial number. And the Shoah is put forward as this, empty void, that everything is dark. And yes, almost everything is dark, but not everything. And I think the rescuers make us aware of that. But that's more nuanced than some of our intellectual inquiries can make.
Sean? These are the last few questions, by the way. I'm sorry, just for the sake of time, because we all want to eat soon, right?
Thanks for the talks. Joseph, I have a question for you. I really liked your talk a lot. I really appreciated it, especially the way you sort of turned the phrase of time heals all wounds into a cliche. Like, focusing on that, it got me thinking about another cliche that often gets tossed around when people try to comfort each other in moments of trauma, which is something like, everything happens for a reason. I hate that. Like, it makes me so mad. But this is one where I find deconstructing it with the help of what you call the naturalizing tendencies of our intellectual culture can be helpful, right? Because the term everything happens for a reason is either obviously false or trivially true, right? And when it's trivially true, it's because everything has an antecedent cause. And if that's what you call a reason, then fine, everything happens for a reason. It doesn't help me much. So what I wanted to ask you is, can you amplify a little bit what your problem is with event causation and the naturalizing tendencies of our intellectual culture, where you see because you sort of gestured at those things as being problematic, but in the course of your talk, you didn't fully unpack why you thought so. And as someone who's kind of identifies, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday as a naturalistically inclined philosopher, I want to hear a bit more about why this tendency is problematic for you in trying to understand the nature of trauma.
Oh, I don't think it is. And I want to go very far with the neuroscientific understanding of these phenomena. And one of the things I was going to say somewhat provocatively is that I think that the problem that neuroscientists, Buddhists, and Foucauldians face alike is how to explain what trauma is without a self. And that's something we share. Philosophy's been at war with conventional wisdom since the start, or at least in the Western philosophical tradition, right? So it seemed like a natural starting place to begin to take that apart. If you hate the expression, everything happens for a reason, you should read Malibu's book, The Ontology of the Accident, because she really wants to push very hard this idea that trauma is completely without reason, almost to the point that it becomes indefensible, right? Like, of course, we can talk about a reason, right? We can talk about neuronal changes, or we can talk about an accident, an accident which has caused the damage. But she wants to substitute, and she wants to say that. I think maybe a pithy way to put it would be if 20th century French philosophy was about the event, some way people think about it, she would say it should have been about the accident, and that might be a completely different kind of category.
Unless every event is an accident, and I just want to say, one way to take both of those cliches is to recognize them and to ask what perhaps can be broken out of them that's not a cliche. For instance, time heals all wounds could be a very powerful invitation to rethink what we mean by time. And everything happens for a reason is clearly a version of philosophy's basic principle of sufficient reason. So the question of the accident and the question as time, as continuity, or as rupture, as epoche, as contingency, those are serious questions. But the way the cliches are used, to put it back in the vocabulary I was using, is how not to begin thinking.
Thank you, everyone, for these talks. They were amazing. I have a question for Professor Newmark that the comment that Professor Bernauer just gave in response to another question has sharpened. So I come from a very, very different set of assumptions about the nature of worlds, people, actions, everything else coming out of the classical Sanskrit tradition. And I would like you to say a little bit about why it is I should find it convincing or compelling that the other is absolute and unknowable. And I ask this question in part because I think there can be quite destructive ethical consequences for the assumption that the other is a generic rupture, is something that in being unknowable thereby dismisses our obligation to understand or know anything about actual other entities in our world who I would think we actually form ourselves in co-constitution with, not as like a chiasmus break and then me, but rather as like what it is to be a world is to have this co-constitution, and that understanding and connection there is really more important. And I think Professor Bernauer's point about how we tend to ignore the people who do good, who are others, is quite relevant to this, because if we can't put any content in the other, then we can't recognize possibilities for action that were not in ourselves previously. So could you try to convince me a little bit why I should take this idea of the other without content seriously?
I would never try to convince you. I can see already that it would be a mistake. Let me call it.
Sorry, I'm serious. I'm a
No.
philosopher. I'd like an argument for it.
Wait.
I'd like a reason to understand why I should engage with this.
In the first place, I would simply want to accept what you say, that to the degree possible, would make every single attempt to be in touch with and understand the other. That should be the basic place to begin. But the issue here is that some of these thinkers are recognizing a spot where a limit to the possibility of understanding, and the respect in the other for that about the other that can never be reduced to our knowledge without reducing the other to the same. So we begin in the same place, that to the degree possible, every effort must be made to understand the other. The example that I would use would be the question of language, to make sure you're on the same wavelength and to understand by an exchange of a conversation or a dialogue. But these thinkers are also pointing to the place where even that possibility of speaking exactly the same language would be a reduction of the other's alterity, and to leave the other's alterity, to make it simply appear as though the other is the mirror image of myself, it is problematic in its own way. That's where I would begin.
We don't have time for a follow-up, but I'm sure you could speak at lunch.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you. Thank you to Dr. Tanky, Dr.